I might be taking my life into my own hands making this kind of recording, but I guess here goes. I, for other reasons, didn't want to make this recording because it's just so slimy to have to deal with the kind of moral degeneracy or that is represented by Duduzane Zuma's political machinations and thoughts, which is hard to tell if this is a kind of convenient or expedient, sort of narrative that he is extolling, which is politically uh, satisfies and ticks all the boxes of his partisanship in the world. I mean, I almost don't think that a member of the ANC can be at all an honest commentator on South African politics, because anyone with any shred of integrity would admit that, especially the ANC under Zuma, was monstrous. It was devastating for the country. Um, and which is also under Zuma is when the escalation of racialist rhetoric occurred and the undermining and sort of complete implosion of the non-racialist uh, legal and constitutional foundation of the new South Africa was attacked directly, which Duduzane Zuma does himself in the interview where I watched him with Mikhaila Peterson. The kinds of sort of rhetorical tricks and arguments that he makes and how he sets things up. I mean, I would call this person a proto-fascist. He is either unconsciously imbibed, this political culture and this political framework of and worldview of how he frames politics because of the people that he rubs shoulders with in the world of the ANC, but also because of his personal experience, which you can see that he bears no shame for the immorality of. He extols quite proudly the listing of all of his business accomplishments. Oh, he's been in this business and that industry and this other industry. Oh, he must be a business genius to be in so many different industries. I mean, does he not have any self-consciousness or self-awareness that that kind of black economic empowerment welfare that was doled out to the politically connected elite, the kind of the legalized corruption, that kind of welfare is what has cost the country its ability to develop and grow and have an authentic entrepreneurial class that was vibrant and capable of providing opportunities for people and having real authentic networking and skills development. We traded all of that for this artificial empowerment scheme, which is essentially there to provide welfare for black elites, essentially, and those who are especially politically connected in terms of state tenders. But business essentially has to the private sector in South Africa has to specifically reach certain quotas and targets that have been mandated by the government, and so you have this whole, I would even call them an artificial middle class, in which their credentials don't mean anything because their work experience is artificially propped up by this mandated labor demand. And so this is what has crippled the economy, in fact, because entrepreneurs that usually give people their first work experience can't retain black professional or skilled black labor because that labor, as soon as it's given experience and skills, gets headhunted by the big companies. And so the I mean, I've known entrepreneurs that have immigrated, that have left the country because they can't handle the staff turnover. They can't handle having their workers constantly headhunted because there's a premium on black labor because of this racialized racial politics that has been infused in the labor market, making it a dysfunctional labor market. So these are the kinds of things that Duduzane Zuma personally has. You can see that he wears it. He's just automatically entitled to this kind of stuff. You can't, you can't look in the closet of this kind of. And I'm not even talking about the probable overt corruption, which we can never know about because his father, being the president, did everything in his power to stop himself from being prosecuted. I mean, he should have already gone to court for corruption. The ways in which the ANC government has destroyed the integrity of the judiciary is insane. And I mean, I don't even have to speculate about people that should have been prosecuted and that weren't. I can talk specifically about the substantive law itself is utterly unconstitutional and corrupt. In terms of the black economic empowerment legislation, it is completely unconstitutional. That form of affirmative action that is being employed by black economic empowerment, that is the farce of the new South Africa. That is the poison pill that destroys everything. And the only way to disguise this corruption, essentially, is to play racial narratives and race-baiting games. The ANC sports minister is constantly race-baiting. Tito Mboweni himself, also the former finance minister, constantly race-baiting. That's all they can do, because that's the only mantra that can validate or legitimize the ANC or any kind of support for the ANC. Only makes sense if you can divert pressure into some kind of racial scapegoating, into the kind of the system itself is broken. Don't blame the government. Everyone should do more. This is what Duduzane Zuma does. This is what I would call the adaptable face of fascism. Very craftily, very, very conveniently collectivizing blame. I mean, any half-serious commentator would say, first of all, the ANC is not the ruling party. The ANC is the governing party, and it does not deserve to govern. And that must be the first thing that must be stated. And in some sense, this is lost in the news media. The news media has not tried to promote democratic literacy and political empowerment of the people themselves. Instead, they have themselves been diverted into the race baiting and the black pride, racialism, and all that kind of stuff because, well, a lot of the media is actually owned by ANC connected people or people that have been enriched by tenders and things like that, by this corrupt governmental money. It is a kind of hegemonic. It's almost being run like a one-party state already. But ideologically, the problem here is that the ANC does not respect personal liberty and freedom. And they keep on playing this fake game that they are promoting solidarity for the people, that they are providing some kind of socialist welfare system, and that they're looking after people, and that it's just the private sector that isn't creating enough jobs or something like that. Never mind all the waste and inefficiency and imposition that they have on private business to destroy it, while they essentially reverse the role. They say that private business should be like the government giving people things, and the government should be like the private sector, providing work for people and having a state-led developmental program. All these, they've got the whole thing arse backwards. And then when their policy fails, when you don't have job creation, when you have negative growth and all these things, instead of actually looking at their own policy, they double down and they say we need even more stringent, radical economic transformation of an even exacerbated state-led program. It's absolutely crazy. There's no political accountability for their failure. And the thing that disguises all of this is the race baiting and the race grifting and talking about the the black identity needing to regain its racial pride, and needing to have its racial pride bestowed on it, and people must conform to this kind of language policing, which Duduzane Zuma also kind of hearkens to and extols in this interview. It's very disgusting and slimy how he sets this up as a kind of as an emotional motif, as a how would we know if he's not corrupt? Has that ever been tested? And it should have been tested. I mean, when you have that many charges, when you have a prima facie case, which even the prosecutor at the time said that there was. Look, Latin is a dead language. You either say prima facie or prima facie, however you want to pronounce it. But if you have a prima facie case, there was one to be answered, and the pressure that was put on that prosecutor. I mean, he won't admit to it, but I mean, I don't think he would have survived. Well, I mean, that's my opinion on it, I guess. But anyway, that's perhaps besides the point. Okay, let me not mix in the practical political arguments with the clear immorality of Duduzane Zuma. Either this person is nescient, he's culpably ignorant of his own views, or they are contrived in order to help him out, being the son of a former president, a president that literally presided over the worst period of South African history in the new era. I mean, the kinds of atrocities even. I mean, there's no political accountability for any of this. And I mean, you can even play Jacob Zuma, the former president's own voice, saying that he will submit himself to being prosecuted, that they must come and prosecute him. And then he gives a completely opposite line where he says you can't have a government that is prosecuting members of its own ruling party. The flip-flopping, the utter, there's no consistency with these people. It's always just continuing the grift as the real character and nature of the ANC becomes more and more evident. And I mean, this is a party that runs on state patronage, that runs on exploitation and corruption. And it never should have happened because it's unconstitutional. The legislation, how they've legalized the corruption, is unconstitutional. But essentially the Constitutional Court, instead of standing up for a Section 1 value of non-racialism, has said we can't apply the limitations clause to affirmative action policy because the government has a governmental prerogative to set this legislation. And so they won't even test the constitutionality of it. They say it is beyond the court, essentially. It's utterly disgusting. There's no excuse for this. And now we have discovered that appointments to the bench, appointments to the judiciary were decided by the ANC Cadre Deployment Committee. They have been choosing these judges. They have been selecting these judges and implanting them to sow this ideological race baiting into the law itself. They have institutionally corrupted the law in order to facilitate their corruption. And then the news media and play the same narrative that Duduzane Zuma plays, where they make it all this emotional sort of thing, where we don't even have the clarity. I mean, this thing that is this racialist policy, which is a bit of a political football now, should have never been allowed to become a political football. It should have been removed by the courts. But essentially, they can say that anyone who is against this form of affirmative action is against black people, or some crazy thing like that, when it's really how black elites are using the poor as a human shield in order to facilitate and disguise their corruption and immorality. The same immorality that Duduzane Zuma has been engaged in, because even if there weren't any overt corrupt things that he was a part of, the law itself is immoral. Most people know this. Most people, black professionals worth their salt, won't work in South Africa because it imposes on their fundamental integrity. They don't want to be looked at and have people wonder, did they get that post because of affirmative action, or do they actually earn that position? How can they, so instead they go to London. I mean, the best of the best in South Africa, they immigrate right away. They just go. I mean, do you know how many black professionals from South Africa are working in London and in America? They get out of this hellhole that has been, because the legislation itself imposes racial consciousness, because the only way to legitimize that kind of disgusting law, I mean, basically, when apartheid ended, everyone's identity document, the last digit in your identity document was actually a designation of your racial group. And when apartheid ended, they removed that, and everyone's last digit of their identity, of their ID number, was randomized to remove the racialist. Now we shouldn't have done that, because now we have new racialist legislation. We have this black economic empowerment. So now that we have black economic empowerment, we should bring back the old identity document, because, I mean, what the hell are we even doing? I mean, everyone has to self-declare what race they are, which it hasn't been legally tested yet, but technically there's nothing stopping anyone from putting down whatever race they want to when they're asked what racial group that they belong to. That would be one way to sort of push this point, because, I mean, it's utterly disgusting. And what's worse is that people get the benefits not because they're disadvantaged, but just because of the color of their skin. And so, I mean, it's like it's an IQ test question. If all boys wear blue, but not all people that wear blue are boys, if I tell you that someone is wearing blue, do you know if they're a boy or not? No, you don't know. And that is the lacuna, that is the gap in the law and in the morality. That's the moral corruption that allows rich millionaires to use the poor as a human shield for their corruption and for their enrichment. Instead of having affirmative action that actually develops skills, or that actually goes towards creating a subsidy for businesses to train people or something like that, or tries to actually find a particular disadvantage and ameliorate that particular disadvantage, that the affirmative action actually targets disadvantage, not race. And so you actually test if someone has this, because the policy is designed to actually do something to the disadvantage, to mitigate it or get rid of it. And then you can actually test, or then you can actually know if the policy is good or not. You can know if that particular program made in line with that policy is a good program. And then you can refine programs. You can actually work out if they're, what their efficacy is, if it's worth the trade. And then you can actually measure it by its effects. Whereas now, because this kind of mandate in black economic empowerment is so general, so generalized and systematized, it cannot be judged. It cannot be politically vetted. It's disgusting, because it's making a false moral equivalency. It's utterly corrupt. And this moral corruption is exactly what facilitates the state corruption and the political corruption, but also this ideological corruption, I'll call it that, being pumped out by the academia, the race and gender studies, the latest version of Aryan studies, essentially, because they teach people that certain people of a certain race have a kind of moral superiority based on their inheritance from society, based on not on their genetic inheritance, but on their socioeconomic inheritance. So you, you have this disgusting moral confection, which makes it impossible to actually hold government accountable for its policy. And instead of having the news media educate people about policy and about, how different political parties have different ideas about policy and all these, it's just diverted into overt race baiting. Um, so this is the era that we live in. And Duduzane Zuma calls the 1994 New South Africa, New Democratic Dispensation, he calls that a farce. How disgusting. How convenient for the ANC to say that at this point in time, for a member of the ANC to say that. Instead of call democracy a farce instead of blaming the ANC for being a terrible government and a terrible governing party. People need to know about their political power instead of being disempowered by the disgusting narrative being cast and spun by people like Duduzane Zuma, who are always connected to the ANC or other racialist type political parties like the EFF. It's the same mentality. Okay, let me just see. I've got a lot of things to mention here. So, yeah, this kind of leveraging the politics of revenge, which ends up hurting everyone, including the poor, and helping to enrich the politically connected elite. It's kind of racialist revenge dynamics that the black pride needs to be elevated and white pride or something like that, or white integrity needs to be deflated, because otherwise how are you going to, it's a way of framing the world. It's a very fascistic way of framing the world. It's also pretty ideologically parasitic. But the ideology that this is a part of essentially continues to cut at the concept of an independent citizenry, of independent citizens that have freedom and liberty in their own right. And obviously, poor people are being devastated by poverty, and that needs to be alleviated. But in the fake panic, in the fake moral panic of saying, well, the government needs more control in order to alleviate poverty. And how is it done? Grabbing more power and grabbing and trying to mandate things against the private sector. How is it performed doing that? And now it says that it needs to do that even more, as if expropriation without compensation would help the situation, somehow giving land, creating a feudal peasantry. I mean, people don't want land. There are very few people that need land, and literally the government owns 70% of all the land in South Africa. There is plenty of land. The problem is not land. The problem is development. People don't want to go be subsistence farmers. Very few people want to do that. People want to be included in the economy. They want to develop. Again, the kind of way that the ANC is promoting these policies, which are obviously there for the ANC government and the ANC connected elite to get their hands on more resources because they have already depleted the state. They have already bankrupted so many state-owned enterprises. They have stolen so much from the state already that now they need to expropriate without compensation the private sector in order to facilitate more of the state patronage. It's a parasite that needs any honest political commentator would say that the ANC does not deserve to be a governing party. But the black pride, sympathy, demand, and extraction is essentially the only diversion that can be fed through the media, and that can be the political narrative in order to disguise this. So yeah, I mean, they use the idea that they need emergency powers to give more freedom and more alleviation to disadvantaged people as the pretext for just more theft and elite enrichment. It's quite interesting, but on the South African flag, red and blue are both represented and in equal proportions. And you could say that red symbolizes solidarity and blue symbolizes liberty and freedom. And they have to be equal. And right now we have an ANC that does not give a damn about freedom and liberty. They only care, supposedly, they use the rhetoric of solidarity and needing to provide for the poor and things like that. And they end up destroying both, and they do nothing in terms of actually helping people that are disadvantaged. And this is all somewhat because they have betrayed the Constitution. But I mean, just because that constitutional betrayal has been supported by this fad in academia, with identity politics, and it's helpful for the political people in power. Uh, the morality that the state was founded on, that if we would just regroup on that morality, we would actually have a functioning political arena. We would actually have a real democracy, which has been diluted by this fascistic groupthink that's been promulgated by the news media and that fake aspect of academia that hate liberty and freedom for the individual. They only believe in liberty for the group, pride, whatever that means. That ideological abstraction that allows them to use that weird nebulous generalization to disguise their immorality. You can see all of this is always leads to the using the voice of a moral paternalism that never has real political responsibility or accountability, because moral paternalism is because when you take that role with the public, you're not speaking in the language of democracy anymore. You're speaking in the language of fascism. The government is not a ruling government. It's not a ruling party. There's no right to rule. It's the right to govern, and the government must be structured by the constitution and by the democracy. Now, these are the basics that should have been driven by the news media. But this politically driven political disempowerment of the people that has kept on telling them that this is the ruling party, not just a governing party. The electorate has been literally made democratically illiterate by this disgusting racialist narrative, and it's a form of disenfranchisement that's hard-boiled democracy in this toxic rhetoric. And obviously, a large component of this is a bit of a media conspiracy that the ANC, with its ideology of so-called anti-racism, you know, decrying that certain things are offensive. So if you can just say, well, this is offensive to my identitarianism of my black pride, then you can't have democratic literacy anymore because you're being contorted by these disgusting emotional rules of this kind of politics of blunt political power and rulership. That it's regarded as this moral paternalist ruler instead of just a government. And so that's why they lean hard into this rhetoric of charity, and that we need more charity, and that capitalism is evil, and so we need more programs like Black economic empowerment, welfare, and obviously to alleviate people that are in immediate hunger and things like that. It would be nice. I mean, we could probably, if we didn't have, we could probably pay for a feeding program if we just didn't have something like public health care. If we converted public health care into a kind of, if we privatized public health care, and maybe we had more of a kind of a subsidized public health care, with perhaps some treatments, being completely subsidized, but basically scaling back public health, we could probably forward something like a feeding scheme. Perhaps we would eventually migrate into something like the Singaporean model of subsidized health, but I mean, it's you can't describe the Singaporean model as either public health or private health. It's a very interesting hybrid, but there is so little ideological rigor and structure within the ANC. It's just this grifting of saying how evil capitalism is, and how essentially the government is after the government has essentially destroyed people's ability to develop, that then says, we'll give you the lifeline, so vote for us, and we'll give you liberation through us, through your political affiliation. It's like a kind of feudalism. It's disgusting. And the inability of the news media to actually promote a kind of democratic literacy, but instead to just sort of play into this lowest common denominator, race baiting, and racial narrative framing of politics is such a gift to the ANC, and for keeping its for dressing up its destructive policies in some modicum of legitimacy, because somehow it's seen as the moral antidote for the solution that we need more of, even though it is the core of the destruction and devastation. And so then we get to listen to people like Duduzane Zuma, with his moral degeneracy, with his entitlement, that he's lived with this political silver spoon in his mouth, issuing his convenient diagnosis, convenient for his family, for himself, for his own history of his immorality and profiting from black economic empowerment, continuing the ANC ideological unaccountability and scapegoating the problems that South Africa faces and systematizing these problems into the collective. That somehow we're all responsible for this. I mean, in a developing country, you expect there to be a high growth rate. The ANC government in South Africa achieved a negative growth rate before coronavirus. Before the COVID-19 crisis, South Africa was already in negative growth. You have to do something very wrong to have negative growth in a developing country. Everybody else in our region has growth north of 5%. So what makes South Africa different? It's the parasitism is what makes South Africa different. It's that simple. And then we have to listen to the toxic rhetoric from the sons of parasites, but also people that have engaged in the parasitism themselves and been enriched by that parasitism as they count themselves business gurus and accomplished business people. No self-awareness, no shame, no accounting of any of this, just pure entitlement and systemizing the guilt.